Welcome, welcome. I'm so excited you've joined me today as we are kicking off our summer Sunday school series for our adult Sunday school classes. For the last 14 weeks, we've been studying the book of Romans, and we've had lots of awesome conversations, but we're shifting gears this summer and we're going to dive into some of the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Proverbs. And then we're going to spend a little time talking about Song of Solomon or Song of Songs towards the end of the summer. We're going to kick things off with Proverbs, though. So as we start this morning, or as we start today, will you pray with me? God, I thank you for today, and I thank you for your word, and I pray that as we begin this study on the book of Proverbs, that you will mold us and teach us and shape us and teach us more about you and about how we can live a life that is wise and follow your wise paths for us, God. We love you and we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So today, before we dive in, we are going to be looking at Proverbs chapter 1, specifically verses 7 through 19. But I wanted to start off with a little bit of background information about the book of Proverbs. If you were able to catch Pastor Dana's Wednesday night Bible study a few weeks ago, he kind of gave an overview of the whole book. So I'm not going to do something quite that extensive, but I thought it might be helpful if we took a look at the first few verses in Proverbs 1 and kind of talk about what we can glean from those first 6 verses. But first, let's talk about what type of literature this is. So Proverbs is not a story. It's not a letter. Instead, it is what we would call wisdom literature. And it is written in the form of Hebrew poetry. And so by wisdom literature, I mean, it focuses a lot on wisdom and how to live that. So in the Old Testament, we have different types of literature, and several other books are also considered wisdom literature, like Ecclesiastes or the book of Job. So we have, and what they have in common is they all focus on wisdom. And so that's what we're going to see right off the bat here in Proverbs. It is, like I said, it's Hebrew poetry. So it's written in a poetry format, but not necessarily like rhyming poetry, but it is poetic in the way that it is written. Not written like a narrative. It's not written like a list of like laws or anything like that. It's definitely poetry. So a proverb, though, tends to be a brief statement that is often an observation about the world around, or it is, and it's usually grounded in experience. And we'll see that as we start to move through our passage for today. So let's start off by reading Proverbs 1 through 6. We're going to start with those 6 verses. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. For learning about wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for gaining instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity, to teach shrewdness to the simple, knowledge and prudence to the young. Let the wise also hear and gain in learning, and the discerning acquire skill. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. So in these first 6 verses, we really get a lot of good information about, it kind of sets up and serves as an introduction for the whole book. So our first verse, it talks about the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. And how we understand of Solomon really could be in several different ways. One, we know Solomon was considered to be very wise, and he spoke many proverbs. And so it is definitely possible that he wrote them. So of Solomon, does it mean that he wrote them all? Does it mean that he wrote some of them? Does it mean that he collected them, or that they were written for him? Well, it could mean any one of those things, but in some way they're connected to Solomon. And there's some other headings later on in Proverbs, and I'm sure we'll talk about them at different points, that indicate the Proverbs were from maybe a different era in history or Israel's history, or attributed to different people. So we know for sure that, though, that at least this first section is somehow connected to Solomon King Solomon, who was the son of David. And so that's the first thing we notice. The other things we get in verses 2 through 6, we can get a lot about the kind of the purpose of the Proverbs. So let's look at that. So it talks about how Proverbs are for learning about wisdom and instruction, that they're for understanding words of insight, gaining instruction in wise dealing, teach shrewdness to the simple, knowledge and prudence to the young, let the wise hear and gain in learning. Hearing a theme here, the word wise is here a lot. But it's about learning wisdom. We also hear that it's geared towards young, like the younger people, those who are still learning how to live and how to live rightly. And as we keep going through this early part, we see this focus on learning how to develop a good pattern of living, how to live well. And so that brings us to verse 7. And I didn't read it earlier, but I'm going to go ahead and read it right now. It's the last verse in this opening prologue. It says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So this idea of the fear of the Lord is something that's going to show up several times through the course of Proverbs. And in a lot of ways, verse 7 serves as kind of our jumping off point, our motto for the entire book. So the fear of the Lord. So we don't mean like, I'm scared, right? The fear of the Lord is more of understanding who God is and responding to him rightly, giving God the respect, the awe, the loyalty, whatever, like that he deserves. So we respect God because he's God, and we respond to him in certain ways because he is God and he's deserving of our utmost honor and respect and loyalty and love and all of those things. So we start off right here that fearing the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It is the beginning of our dive into wisdom. So in some ways we could even say that wisdom, living a life of wisdom, starts with living a life that is responding rightly to God. And so definitely when we're talking about wisdom from like a scriptural perspective, from a perspective of a follower of God, a follower of Jesus, we're going to start with fear of the Lord. We have to respond rightly to God in order to even hope to live a wise life and walk in the way of wisdom. And so that's going to set up our study of Proverbs. So fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So that's kind of our close of our prologue, our opening section. And verse 7 represents the beginning of the passage that we're going to focus on today, or that the curriculum focuses on today. And, but I wanted to talk about it kind of as its own part, because I think it is just so central to what we're going to be talking about over the coming weeks. So fear of the Lord. So as you read through Proverbs, which I encourage you to read Proverbs, maybe read a chapter of Proverbs each day as we go through this study. I think it would be really awesome, because we're not going to actually get to talk about each and every point each week. We just don't have enough weeks, and there's 31 chapters. So if you were to read it throughout the duration of our study, you probably could go through the whole entire book of Proverbs twice. But for sure, it would be awesome if you could go through it once as we're doing it. It will help us build a picture and kind of an overall understanding of the book of Proverbs. Because like I said, we're not going to be able to talk about each and every point in here, because there's just so much. So it would just be a really interesting study for you personally through this summer. So we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about verses 8 through 19 in chapter 1. So first I'm going to read them, and then we'll talk a little bit more about them in depth. So starting in verse 8. And by the way, I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version today. When you're reading Proverbs, it's a great idea to read in several different translations. A lot of times I like to read out of the New Living Translation, but I really liked the way that the NRSV phrased things today. So that's the one I chose. So as you're reading, you might consider reading in a couple different translations. It'll give you a more full picture of exactly what the writer was intending. So Proverbs 1, 8 through 19. Hear, my child, your father's instruction, and do not reject your mother's teaching. For they are a fair garland for your head and pendants for your neck. My child, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, and let us wantonly ambush the innocent. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive and whole, like those who go down to the pit. We shall find all kinds of costly things. We shall fill our houses with booty and throw in your lot among us. We will all have one purse. My child, do not walk in their path. Keep your foot from their paths, for their feet run to evil, and they hurry to shed blood. For in vain is the net baited while the bird is looking on, yet they lie in wait to kill themselves and set an ambush for their own lives. Such is the end of all who are greedy for gain. It takes away the life of its possessors. So this section is our first section of like sayings of instructions. And in this part, we see parents to child. So it talks about your father's instruction, your mother's teaching, and then really we hear the father's voice through most of the rest of it. And I think that is so important to think about. So we have these parents who are wanting to protect their child from following the way of folly. We can call it folly here. So the way of sin, following the way of folly. I'll probably refer to it as folly a lot. But following this wrong way, the way that is opposite wisdom, and falling in with the wrong crowd. And I think that it's very interesting. I really like how this section starts talking about your father's instruction, your mother's teaching, how they are a fair garland for your head and pendants for your neck. So living a life that is shaped by those, like the teachings of the good sound teachings of the parents, is living a life that is set apart and marked. So if you think about putting like a garland on your head or a pendant around your neck, in the New Living, it talked about it being, said it would crown you with grace, and it would be a chain of honor. So when I think about when we would use like a crown, like a garland that you would wear on your head, it's like being crowned by something, or wearing a chain around your neck that's going to mark you as something. Like this necklace that I'm wearing today, it's kind of interesting because I got it whenever we went to, when we adopted Jude, and it says mother and son on it. And it's what the character on it, and you probably can't see that, but it's like, it marks me. I like wearing it because it marks me as, Jude's mom. And I love that. Not that I need to be reminded of it, but I love having that, physical reminder around my neck. Sometimes it's just fun. And it's really cool. It's like I'm marked by that. And so when I was thinking about this crown of, the teachings as a crown, a garland on their head, or a pendant around their neck, it's like being marked by following the teaching. So almost like being marked by living this life of wisdom. And we could talk about a lot of ways of how are we marked by wisdom? How are our lives marked in that way? And in some ways too, I think it makes me think about how, as we learn, as we walk in the path of wisdom, and we choose rightly, and we choose to listen and heed the words of those who have walked the path before us, be them parents or friends or mentors, that we grow in our understanding, and we have rewards for for the things that we've learned. And those things are worn as like crowns or as pendants, and we're marked by those things. We're marked by these experiences that we have and the things that we learn from them. And I think that's such a beautiful picture. So we have this garland on our head, like this garland on your head and a pendants around your neck of being marked by following the path of wisdom. And so we see that at the beginning. And then this father launches into this conversation about not picking the path of folly, not picking to follow the enticements of those who are doing wrong. And I think it's interesting because the father chooses not to just say, don't do this. It's wrong and bad. And I said so don't do it. Instead, he chooses to paint this picture of exactly what it is they would be enticing the son to do and how bad it would be. It's kind of almost just like painting this really negative picture with the intention to like dissuade the child from following. And ending ultimately was saying, and by the way, their greed is going to ultimately be their destruction. It's ultimately going to bring about their death. And I just think that's really interesting. Thinking about, like the NLT said it as their love for money robs them of life. And here it talks about all who are greedy for gain. It takes away the life of its possessors. And I just think it's interesting how the father went through and this whole thing like lays out, this is what they're going to think you should do. And it's going to sound great and awesome, but really it's looking like this. And it's this bad, ugly thing that it's going to turn into. I just think it's interesting how, he chooses to paint a picture instead of just say, don't do it. So as we continue to look through this passage, there's lots we could say about the enticements of sin and how real that is. We see that every time we walk around, like we look in our lives, look around our world, enticements of sin are there. But following the path of wisdom and being marked by that, following the path that of fear of the Lord is something that we'll be marked by. So we'll be marked that when we choose that, we'll be marked by our fear of the Lord, our love of God. And that is the path of wisdom. That's what we want to be marked by. So this chapter 1 ends with a focus on wisdom, and it's not part of our curriculum that we're going to focus on today or that we've been talking about. But I did just want to kind of give a concluding thought about it's like this comparison between this call and warning against those against sinners, the way of folly, following that way, versus the call of wisdom and how following the path of the wise will lead to peace. It will lead to right living and right and being at peace. And that's kind of how like the next section talks about as the call of wisdom as opposed to the other one. And we're going to continue having this conversation about wisdom and the way of wisdom versus the way of folly, especially as we continue into in the coming weeks. In these opening sections. Not every section of Proverbs is going to be this one continuous conversation. We'll get to the part where it's like this sentence and then this statement and this Proverbs and that proverb, and they don't necessarily form one cohesive like sentence. But today's section did. And so I think it's just really interesting as we read through Proverbs, if we will allow ourselves to be formed by the words that we read, the statements that we hear, and allow ourselves to really explore what it means to live life with the fear of the Lord as our starting place for wisdom and live a life that is good. Because ultimately that is what Proverbs is going to lay out for us. What does it look like to live a life that is good? What does it look like to live life well? And we're going to see how many different types of Proverbs there are. And we'll talk more about how we should apply Proverbs, different individual Proverbs, and what that can look like going forward. But I think today it's starting to notice what are the patterns of living rightly that Proverbs is laying out for us, and what can that look like going forward. So thank you for joining me today, and I can't wait to continue this conversation through the summer. Bye.